Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of The Red Petrel. Today we will be talking about May Day and the various labor movements going on in the United States today. So joining me today is going to be Ash Levy, who is another member of SSC here at Oglethorpe. And so let's kind of start out. May Day history, go.
So May Day really came out of the Haymarket Affair, which is also known as the Chicago Massacre. It was essentially a strike to get an 8-hour workday, which I'm sure everyone appreciates, which translates into a 40-hour work week when you work 5 days a week, which is the basis for most of the labor movement in the early 1900s, late 1800s in the U.S. And ironically, the U.S. no longer celebrates May Day as our Labor Day because we're scared of the socialists. So basically, there was a huge strike. The police killed a whole bunch of people during this strike, but it was pretty successful in getting the 8-hour workday. So labor movements across the world have declared May 1st International Workers' Day.
Kind of coincides also. Karl Marx was born on May 5th, so
yeah,
it's kind of all piles together.
Yes, but if you look at the U.S. government's website about Labor Day, there is no mention of anything related to May Day. They say the first Labor Day was September 5th, 1882, when in fact May Day's been celebrated for a long time. And right now, if you look at the U.S. media, you'll probably see that you hear reporting about, oftentimes in Seattle, there's a lot of clashes. Or I read somewhere, like they said, the radical anarchists and socialists go out and violently protest on May Day, which is not necessarily true. There has been some violence, but that's usually the exception to the rule, and it's not most people involved.
I like the little insert in there. Not always. Thank you, Black Bloc, for making it difficult for the rest of the socialist movement.
Well, violence does happen, so not acknowledging it is doing a disservice, but it's not the entire movement.
So that's kind of the history. While we could kind of spend basically the rest of a podcast talking just about the history of Labor Day, we're not going to talk about the history of labor movements in the United States. That's going to be a different podcast, which will probably be closer to actual American Labor Day. Instead, we're going to talk about the really interesting news that's kind of been going on in the United States right now, which is the 2018 labor movements among teachers. I'm sure if you own a computer or TV, you have heard about the teacher strikes going on in at least West Virginia if you're on the East Coast. There are strikes going on in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Colorado, Arizona, several other states. Teachers are hopping mad, if you will, about basically stagnated wages, poor work hours, poor funding.
Well, beyond just their poor working conditions, the poor learning conditions for their students. Because at the end of the day, it's not just them that they're worried about, it's the future of this country.
Yeah, one of so we're going to start out with West Virginia. That one's been going on for a while, and I'm sure almost everybody listening has probably at least heard about it in passing. So this actually started out, I believe it started as a union strike, and it kind of...
it was a union strike, but because of so-called right-to-work laws in West Virginia, there's very little strength in most unions in West Virginia, and the state has the power to shut down most strikes anyway because of these really bad labor laws under the guise of right to work. But it did start as a union strike, and the school was out for 5 days or so at first. But it did show that there was power in collective bargaining because they did eventually get their wants.
So it would appear that a deal was reached on February 27th, and on March 3rd, the West Virginia Senate rejected a bill approving the 5% pay raise, which was negotiated. On Sunday, March 4th, communications workers also went on strike. So it looks like West Virginia is just having a bad time with their right-to-work state. So basically, we could call it an unsuccessful strike, but part of the reason why it's an important strike is that it inspired 2 other major ones on our list, Oklahoma and Arizona. Teachers in other states that we've already mentioned have also gone on strike. Really, teachers basically anywhere where unions aren't super strong, you can pretty much go ahead and assume teachers will be or are currently on strike.
Yeah. What's really interesting is that these are mostly in very, very Republican states that have a lot of terrible labor laws. You don't see it happening like in New York City, where teachers actually get tenured after a point.
Yeah.
And they have a really strong teachers union in their public schools.
One of the things that's often discussed about this is that people don't like the tenure systems in places like New York, New Jersey, so on and so forth, because the teachers get in there and they could be pretty bad and you can't get rid of them. So the only counter I have to that is if you look at the education levels of places with no good workers' unions for their teachers versus the education levels of places where they do, the disparity is pretty self-evident. We're going to include in the show notes a little image of the United States heat map of education, where education is good, where it's bad. It kind of lines up with probably everybody's preconceived notions. So interesting.
And West Virginia's government, state legislator, and governor actually responded probably the best out of most of these teacher strikes, because Oklahoma and Kentucky had some horrible things said about the teachers. Like, one of the governors said they were responsible for a lot of child molestation and rape and exposing kids to drugs for the first time because they were striking and not in school. Another time, they got compared to people in World War II that wouldn't accept rations, despite the fact that productivity and GDP has gone up steadily for the past few years, and teachers haven't seen a raise. They haven't even seen a raise at the rate of inflation even.
Yeah, one of the interesting things in the United States is wage stagnation, which is pretty much set in for most of the education field since about the 70s or 80s, depending on what you teach in what level. But if you're just teaching in public education, your wages really haven't gone up functionally since the 70s. Sometimes it goes up based on inflation, but for the most part, you are not actually making more money, even though the economy is growing and getting better. And education is actually, as a whole, getting better. Yeah. Most of the demands are actually pretty reasonable. A lot of places are putting through 5% salary boosts, which is not actually that much. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's actually very low.
Also, with the rising healthcare cost, a lot of teachers are having a problem because the cost of their healthcare has gone up, and that's not being offset either by raising wages, even keeping up with inflation. So they have thousands of dollars more in healthcare costs, and that's not being met. And I don't know if anyone knows this, but in Oklahoma, several school districts have actually gone to a 4-day school week to allow teachers more time to pick up second jobs to make ends meet. We also haven't seen teacher strikes in Miami, but Miami's solution to the high housing costs is to build teacher housing and dorms on the campus of new schools. And I don't know if anyone wants to live. College is fun and all, but our professors don't live with us, and I don't think most professors would want to live on campus. Would you really want to live where you work all the time?
I mean, there's certainly some positives to it, but I don't think anybody wants to live in the worker slum housing. In fact, it was rather unpopular when factories had tenant housing built into the factory, so I can't imagine that it's super popular today now that it's being rebranded.
And imagine having interpersonal, personal relationships, especially at the elementary school level. What if teachers have husbands or boyfriends or other significant others?
We're really doing a lot to walk around the concept of just giving them a raise. If we look at Oklahoma, this is actually a place where a proposal did make it through. A $6,100 raise was proposed on March 31st, which is not what the list of demands that the union laid out was. They demanded a $10,000 raise and a $200 million education funding increase. This is actually because $200 million had been cut from funding, so it wasn't like it was completely out of the blue. Oklahoma routinely has some of the worst education in the United States, so this isn't super shocking that they have poor pay. So of the several states where this is going on, this is probably one of the bigger strikes. The walkout has been going for a really long time.
Yeah. And also in Georgia, where we're located, our governor, for the first time in about a decade, I believe, has fully funded education spending for K through 12 education. And also the governing board of the public universities in Georgia also chose to not raise tuition this year because they got some more funding. But kids graduating high school now, based on the amount of furlough days we've had since they started cutting education spending, have missed the equivalent of a full year of school over the course of their education.
And while I'm sure many students are happy to hear that, it's actually very bad for us in the long run. That means that we have people graduating with a much lower education level than just the years before them. So one of the big issues with all of this isn't so much teachers' wages in general. It's that it's very difficult for teachers to get their wages to be raised. I know a lot of people will say, well, just talk to your bosses, talk to your this, talk to your that, and try to get a wage raise. But the problem is all of these teachers need a wage raise, and it's not happening. And because these right-to-work states don't have a way to get unions to work, it makes it very, very difficult for them to actually get these demands met. We need to stop dialing back workers' rights. There's no real reason to have right-to-work states. I know that the statement right to work sounds really nice, but it's right up there with fair tax. It's not fair to you.
Yeah.
If you are here listening right now and you do not live in a $1 million house, I have bad news. These things are not good for you.
Yeah, and actually, studies have shown that if you give more money to lower middle class and working class citizens, they're more likely to spend it on the economy. But when you give it to the rich, where it's supposedly supposed to trickle down to these working class people, they invest it rather than putting it into the economy.
Basically, one of the big problems with this is that trickle down doesn't work like Republicans say it does. They seem to think that it will raise our consumption, and it doesn't. It raises investment, which is great unless you're kind of at the investment saturation level, which many economists already argue that we are.
Yeah.
So we really don't need to be saving anymore.
And even if we aren't quite at the saturation point, we're close enough that it wouldn't make sense.
A lot of workers are foregoing consumption, which is bad for our economy.
Yeah.
We need people to actually buy potato chips and like stupid things that they don't need. I know that austerity always, sounds like the mature thing to do, but it actually really hurts us.
Well, the whole notion that pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it's kind of hard right now because you can't, if you've missed a year's worth of school, you're already behind, and then you try to get a higher education and you're thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt by the time you graduate, and you are making less and less money, and you just can't catch up to where people were a generation ago.
And a lot of us who might be listening to this might be thinking, well, government jobs are safe, but that's kind of the part of the complaint here is that teachers are government workers, and apparently government jobs aren't safe. It used to be many years ago that these were the kinds of jobs that you wanted to get there very stable. The government likes to keep all of its workers happy because having your people strike when you're the government is very bad. But unfortunately, we've kind of fallen back on that notion, mostly because of how Republican cuts tend to work, where we overvalue the things that corporations sort of do for the economy while very, very highly undervaluing sort of our government spending in the smart places that it can be.
Well, we've written laws so that corporations pay nothing in taxes, even Amazon. Amazon claimed their thing was in a European country, but we all know Amazon's headquartered in the U.S. So the Republicans' tax plans don't really match up, and it seems to be that they are catering to the rich because that's who their donors are.
Well, and, it's worth pointing out that Democratic states are just as guilty. Overall, in the United States, while we can talk about the nice union states where teachers are paid better and generally treated better, cuts to education are pretty much across the board. Everybody's been losing education funding for years, and while unions are doing a really good job of fighting for their individual regional teachers' rights, which is very important, it's very important for us to note that education funding as a whole in the United States has been going down, regardless of what state you're in, and regardless of your workers' rights. This mentality that we don't need to spend as much on schools is actually a really toxic ideal.
Or the new idea that charter schools, under the guise of what they call school choice, that sounds really great, but these charter schools aren't really held to the same standards. They don't have to have the same curriculum. Well, that might be really great. There's some great charter schools for kids with learning disabilities that work really well, but as a whole, they aren't really the best option. And they're run like for-profit businesses by for-profit businesses, corporations essentially, yet they get public money to run the schools. So it's like having a private school, but the government just pays for you to go there.
For those interested, we're going to have in the show notes a couple of links that you can follow, sort of look at how charter schools, a lot of that money doesn't go into what you expect them to go into.
Yeah. Well, especially online charters have been a hot topic.
Oh, yeah. Online school in general, I know that a lot of people started homeschooling, and what's the easiest way to homeschool? Online. Online homeschooling is just actually terrible.
Yeah, well, online homeschooling might work for a homebound student, and if there's like exceptional need in some cases, it's not good as a general education policy.
Yeah, so we're going to have some more links in the description for those of you who are interested in reading a little bit more about that. So you've included in our notes here for what we're going to talk about is JetBlue workers unionized.
Yes.
So what can you tell me about that?
On April 17th, they voted to join the Transport Workers Union. It was a majority of the flight attendants, and I don't know if anyone knows this about flight attendants. They only get paid for the time they're in the air. The time that they're at the airport does not actually count towards their pay, and if they get injured due to turbulence, they might not be eligible for workers' comp or just little things like that. And they kind of have a tough job. I mean, airline travel isn't great as it is. It's not a
Nobody
great...
really wants to be here. So
Yeah.
imagine the person who has to be here, probably not having a good time either. For those of you who haven't flown, who are listening to this, I can assure you the amount of time that plane is sitting waiting on you is pretty big. Compared to how much time that you're waiting on your plane, they're waiting as well for you to board the plane. So it can be pretty unfortunate if you're a flight attendant to be stuck not getting paid but still having to be at work.
And their schedule is also pretty demanding. You're often away from home for long periods of time. There's not really a good way for you to really keep a permanent residence because you're constantly moving around at the need of your airline. If you're lucky, your airline has a major hub where most of your flights are out of.
But not everybody has that.
Yeah.
Especially the smaller air companies, which are now getting a little bit more prominent because they're cheaper. And people, as flight has become more and more necessary for even the lower middle classes, for work and for seeing family and things like that, so too are these smaller airplane companies, which is great. It's great to see a little bit more competition in what is otherwise three major companies that fly everybody everywhere. The interesting thing here is the flight attendant numbers. 2,661 flight attendants versus 1,387. So about, I guess we could say 2 to 1, voted to join the TWU, which is the Transport Workers Union.
Yeah. But they were also not the first JetBlue employees to do it. The pilots and co-pilots, like all the people flying your planes, joined the Airline Pilots Association back in 2014. In a lot of ways, it's great to join union because you get these collective bargaining rights.
Yeah, collective bargaining is a really important necessity for a lot of these airlines. So it'll be interesting to see how some of the other airlines respond to this, or if people might be flocking to work at JetBlue, or if we might see some other things cropping up with the other smaller ones. I know that some of the bigger ones already have unions, but...
And if we've learned anything from the teacher strike is that collective bargaining still works, because if you shut down an essential service, people will listen.
Well, and to sort of contrast this with that, when we're looking at some of the failures that are happening with the teacher strikes, part of the reason is because a day with schools shut down is not necessarily a negative on a Republican's platform. I mean, that's still money that they're not spending, as opposed to a corporation where every day that they're not selling products can be really detrimental to them. If you're the government, people have to pay taxes anyway. So whether we are getting that service or not can be really detrimental to the actual argument power. Collective bargaining doesn't always work as well with the government.
Yeah. Although, while the Republicans might be in favor, their governors are still trying to smear these teachers pretty harshly, calling them that they're teenagers that want a new car. They're like people that didn't accept rations in World War II, or that they cause children to be exposed to drugs and sexual abuse. It's kind of obnoxious, especially when some of the teachers still work to get their children free and reduced lunch.
Yeah. Basically, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh my gosh, that's my state, or you already know that your state doesn't pay teachers super well, keep in mind that while you might be sitting here thinking, well, I hope my teachers go out on strike soon, part of it's you. You actually vote for your local representatives, and those people help set the policies for those teachers. We'll have some more links on how you can help the teachers who are currently striking, but we're also just suggesting to our audience, if you are an American citizen and you can vote in your state, vote.
Midterms are coming up this year.
Coming up.
Look at your states. Georgia, the voter registration deadline has passed, but primaries are May 22nd.
So thank you so much for listening in. We will have a second follow-up on this. We will be discussing the actual history of May Day, and that will be with our third host, who has not been on any of our podcasts so far. That'll be Alex Mixon, who is a history major here. So he'll be coming in to share some early American history with us about the labor movement. So thank you so much for listening in, and I hope you all have a great day. Tune in next time.